Okay, well, I probably don't need any introduction. I've spoken to you guys a number of times on historical topics. Now let me see if I can get this one up here. Share screen. All right.
All right, Dave.
Can people see that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. This guy's kind of fascinated me for a number of years. He's the most prominent Jewish American of the middle 19th century. And you'll see as I go through these slides, his career and what he really meant, not only in the United States, but in Great Britain after the Civil War. So Judah Philip Benjamin was born August 1811 in St. Croix, British West Indies. And he died in Paris at age 73. And this is a traditional photo of Judah P. Benjamin. And one thing you'll notice is he has this is his resting face. And he has that perpetual smile that people noted. And his enemies called it a smirk. So you can imagine the darkest days of the Confederacy, he's walking around Richmond with a smirk on his face, not because he was happy with Confederate defeats, but that's the way he looked. Here's a quote from a professor who's, I guess, one of the best informed Benjamin scholars. Like many politicians even today, he was hated by his opponents and adored by his friends, charming, aggressive, and egotistical. And he was a man acquainted with grief, and he was tortured with doubt about his mission in life. His parents were Sephardic Jews whose ancestors had been kicked out of Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella at the beginning of the Inquisition. If you remember, all the Jews in Spain had about 2 months to get out of the country or convert or suffer persecution. So they moved to England, and his father was a merchant in England. He saw possibilities in St. Croix. So they moved to St. Croix, where Judah was born. Then he moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina when he was 2. And then eventually to Charleston, which had the largest Jewish population in the United States. His father was one of the first founders of the Reformed Jewish congregations in the United States. So his father was very religious and tuned into his Jewish heritage. Judah really wasn't. Throughout his life, there's very little evidence that he spent any time attending synagogue or supporting any kind of Jewish causes. He was very smart. He went into Yale at age 14. He left 2 years later without completing his studies because he could not pay his gambling debts. And as you know, in those days, a gentleman always honored his debts, and because he couldn't, he was thrown out of Yale. And when he was 17, he moved in New Orleans, Louisiana. In 1840, New Orleans was a very prosperous city because all the trade from the middle of the United States came down the Mississippi River. It was the biggest cotton port in the world. It was a great place for a young man to seek his fortune. And it also had a pretty large and accepted Jewish population. So this was a great place for Judah Benjamin to make his mark. So he moves to New Orleans and he starts clerking at a mercantile firm and then a law firm. And to earn a few bucks, he taught English to the French Creoles, and in exchange, they taught him French, which of course later was very important because French was still the language of law in those days, and it helped him a lot. And he managed to pass the bar in 1832, and he married one of his students. She was the daughter of a prominent French Creole family. At the time he married her, she was only 16, and she reportedly had a scandalous reputation, which in those days might have meant something just that she was seen outside her house without a chaperone. We really don't know what scandalous meant in those days. They only had one daughter, Nanette, and she was raised as a Catholic per Judah's consent. I think when you marry a Catholic, there's a lot of pressure to raise your kids as Catholic, and he had no objection to that. The wife and daughter moved to Paris in 1845. And for the rest of his life, until very near the end, he only visited them once a year. And it was common knowledge at the time that his wife, Natalie, had numerous affairs, both in New Orleans, later in Washington, and then in Paris. And he accepted all of this, and some contemporaries and historians still believe that he may have been a closeted homosexual, but there's little evidence that I could find of that. In New Orleans, well, there's a picture of his wife, Natalie St. Martin. She lived till 1891. She looks like she may have a scandalous reputation. I don't know. Looks like she had a perpetual smile on her face too.
From other things.
He had a nice townhouse in New Orleans. It's still there, and it's currently a strip joint named Temptations. So he's established himself in New Orleans. He's a lawyer, and he becomes a politician. As I said, New Orleans was quite a port, so he got a lot of practice in commercial law and international trade. One of his prominent cases, he won a case against some slave importers who wanted compensation for slaves that had rebelled on the ship. And his argument in favor of the insurers not having to pay was published by abolitionist societies. And he argued in the trial that slaves were human beings who cherished their liberty. Like most lawyers, he could argue either side of a case, and that was not his personal view, because he owned a sugar plantation named Belle Chase. And rather than cotton, he grew sugar cane, and he tested various new varieties of cane to see how they would grow in the Louisiana climate. And he had 140 enslaved humans on his plantation, even though he was thought to be a humane master. The plantation really wasn't a success. He was a member of the Whig Party, and he was elected to the State House of Representatives in 1842, and he helped Zachary Taylor carry Louisiana. In 1852, he was already in the state Senate, and he was chosen to be one of Louisiana's U.S. senators. There's a picture of his sugar plantation house that he owned for only 8 years. And this was demolished in 1960. So he becomes a U.S. senator, and he was appointed by the legislature of Louisiana. In those days, you did not have the direct election of senators. He was appointed in 1853. He was not the first U.S. senator of Jewish descent. That was a guy from Florida named David Yulee. But what is notable about this is he's a United States senator. He's of Jewish background. And we think of England at the time as being very tolerant towards Jews. Well, in fact, Parliament in England would not seat a Jew until 1857. So he was a Jew in the U.S. Senate 4 years before England even allowed them. There's a funny story. In 1847, the city of London elected one of the Rothschilds as their representative to Parliament. And the Tory party, which was in control, refused to seat him. So at the beginning of every Parliament, Rothschild would walk down the aisle in the house in England. He would go up to his seat. He would sigh, turn around, and walk out. And he did that for 10 years until they finally seated him. What's more, I found out that Oxford and Cambridge would not give degrees to Jewish students until 1871. They were allowed to attend, but they weren't given their degrees. So in retrospect, the United States was well ahead of Great Britain in the terms of treatments of Jews. So when the Whig Party collapsed, Benjamin joined the Democrats in 1856. They were the party of the South, the party of pro-slavery. He turned down 2 chances to be appointed to the Supreme Court. And he did this because in those days, US senators were allowed to continue their lucrative law practices, argue cases in front of the Supreme Court and things of that nature. So he wanted to maintain his income as a lawyer rather than be appointed to the Supreme Court, where he wouldn't be allowed to do that sort of thing. So when he gets to Washington, he meets Jeff Davis, who was a senator from Louisiana and Secretary of War. And Jeff Davis had been married to Zachary Taylor's daughter, so they knew each other as Zachary Taylor friends. Just a little review here of President Jefferson Davis. He was born in 1808. He went to West Point. He was a member of Congress. He led a regiment, the Mississippi Rifles in the Mexican War. He too was a planter of cotton. He owned 113 slaves. His second wife was Marina Davis, who was granddaughter of the governor of New Jersey. He served as a senator from Mississippi twice, once as a Whig and later as a Democrat. He was U.S. Secretary of War under Franklin Pierce. You know, of course, that he was the only president of the Confederacy. And after the war, he was held as a prisoner in Fort Monroe for 3 years, never tried for treason. And historians still argue about why that was. And after the war, he got into the insurance business in Memphis, and a female admirer of his gave him her plantation, Beauvoir, in Biloxi, Mississippi. So the Confederacy secedes, Davis is elected president, and he forms a cabinet. And he's good friends with a prominent lawyer named Judah P. Benjamin. So he names him as Attorney General. And of those 7 or 8 cabinet members there, Benjamin and Postmaster John Reagan are the only 2 that served throughout the entire war. The Confederacy honored Benjamin by putting him on their $2 bill. It's probably worth more now than it was then, but there he is with his perpetual smirk on the Confederate $2 bill. So his first role in the cabinet is the Attorney General. He's the first Jewish American to hold a cabinet position in a North American government. Up until that time, none of the US presidents, including Abraham Lincoln, had a Jewish American in their cabinet. He had nothing to do. There was no court system for the Confederate States of America, and in fact, they never created a Supreme Court. He wanted to keep the capital in Montgomery, but getting Virginia into the war necessitated them moving it to Richmond. And as Attorney General, he proposed that the government buy 150,000 bales of cotton to sell in Europe. And Davis rejected that. He thought an embargo on cotton would bring Europe into the war, specifically Great Britain. So they embargoed cotton, and they didn't believe the war was going to last more than 3 months anyway, because as you know, one Southern gentleman could lick 10 Yankee clerks. So the war wasn't going to last very long. We're going to embargo cotton. Benjamin didn't like that, but he went along with it. So finally, in October of 1861, he leaves the job of Attorney General, and he's appointed Secretary of War. As Secretary of War, he's responsible for supervising the army, feeding them, supplying, and arming them. Well, Judah Benjamin was a lawyer. He had no military or executive experience. And he immediately got into disagreements with General Beauregard and Stonewall Jackson. Jackson in particular threatened to resign because Judah Benjamin was micromanaging Jackson's corps, and Jackson certainly knew more about the military and strategy than Benjamin did. Then there was a series of Confederate disasters. Fort Henry and Fort Donelson out in the Western Theater fall to the Union forces under U.S. Grant. And then there's a loss at Roanoke Island. And the mob was after Benjamin at this point, the Richmond mob. And Mary Chestnut, who the famous diarist of the Confederacy, she's noted in her diary that the mob calls him Mr. Davis's pet Jew. In light of all this, Davis had to replace him, but he doesn't kick him out of the cabinet. He appoints him Secretary of State in March of 1862, which is probably where he should have been the whole time. This was the battle that sort of sealed it for Judah Benjamin. Roanoke Island is in Pamlico Sound in North Carolina. General Burnside mounted an attack, and 2,500 Confederates surrendered. And this fort in Pamlico Sound remained in Union hands for the rest of the war. And what happened was the commander had requested reinforcements, And Jeff Davis was the man who said, no, we're not going to send them. But of course, the order got passed through the Secretary of War. So Benjamin loyally took the responsibility for not sending the reinforcements. And he got moved to Secretary of State. And this is probably a good time to talk about anti-Semitism. Some of this is pretty raw, but we shouldn't sweep history under the rug. It's a fact of what happened in the United States, the points of view of the people. John Beauchamp Jones, who wrote a rebel war clerk's diary, he was a northern journalist who had Southern views. He moved to Richmond and became a clerk in the War Department. In his diary, he makes 40 derogatory references to Jews. And you can see here that these comments from Jones and Southern Punch magazine and the Richmond Examiner, which was a prominent anti-Davis newspaper in Richmond, all characterized Jews as avaricious and the typical prejudices of the day, even of today, of how Jews conduct business. Congressman Henry Foote claimed that Benjamin was using his status as Secretary of State to allow immigration of swarms of Jews from all over the world. And one reason they never had the Supreme Court was Foote put his foot down and refused to vote for it as long as Benjamin shall continue to pollute the ears of Davis. And then you can see Senator Hilton's comment there about Jews as vultures. Now, this wasn't just Southern anti-Semitism. There was equal amount of anti-Semitism in the North. And the most egregious example was U.S. Grant's General Order 11 in Memphis, where he expelled Jews from the Department of Tennessee for speculating. The problem was that if you had $12,000 in Tennessee or Mississippi, you could buy 1,500 pounds of cotton and sell it for $50,000 in Kentucky. So all the speculators, even though most of them were in fact Union officers up to the rank of general, were doing the speculation. Grant expelled the Jews. And when this reached Washington, the brown stuff hit the fan, and the Lincoln administration quickly rescinded the order. And that's one of the blots on U.S. Grant that is still remembered to this day. Well, what was so important about cotton? They thought that they would hold Britain hostage. In 1860, the South had shipped 3.8 million bales. And by 1862, with the embargo, there was none. And it's estimated that 25% of Britain's workers were somehow involved in the manufacture of cotton clothing, textiles. However, the British merchants were not stupid. They had seen the war coming for years, and they had approximately a 2 to 3 year stockpile of cotton sitting in the warehouses in Liverpool and other centers of the textile trade. And they also had time to start developing new sources in India, which was part of the British Empire, Egypt, which was also part of the British Empire, and Brazil. So by embargoing cotton, even though there was a federal blockade, a lot of it would have gotten through, and England, would have gladly bought it rather than looking for these other sources. But The other thing to remember, however, is that Britain also needed to import 25% of its foodstuffs from the US. So this was obviously a break on them being able to recognize the Confederacy, because if they had recognized the Confederacy, absent the whole slavery issue, and foodstuffs had been embargoed from the United States, Britain would have had a hard time feeding their people. So our friend Benjamin knows all of this. He has international contacts. He's named Secretary of State, and it was very close. The Confederate Senate almost rejected his appointment. As such, he formed a close association with Varina Davis. The two of them worked. Varina Davis was Jeff Davis' wife, and they worked very closely to monitor, we'll say, Jeff Davis's personality. And there are gossips, of course, who think that Varina Davis and Judah Benjamin were having an affair, but there's really no, it was just ugly gossip in Richmond. His principal task as Secretary of State was to get Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy. Napoleon III, who was the Emperor of France, he wanted to, and especially after the 7 Days Campaign, where you'll remember Robert E. Lee pushed McClellan back away from Richmond, and for a couple of years we managed to save the Confederacy. But Britain hesitated. The Palmerston government in Britain was certainly pro-South. The ruling class in Britain was pro-South. But as you recall, they got a lot of their food from the United States, and to support a slave holding country that not only held slaves, but proudly held slaves, was a bridge that Queen Victoria and the ruling class in Britain hesitated to cross. Then comes the Union victory at Antietam and Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, which made recognition even less probable. So Benjamin realized at this point that we're not going to get any recognition from Europe. So after Gettysburg and Vicksburg fell in July of 1863, relations with Britain became so strained that he expelled all the remaining British consuls. At one point, he had correspondence with the Pope, and letters did go back and forth through the blockade. There were many Confederate councils in Europe, and there was one in the Vatican, and they tried to get the Pope to condemn the Irish who enlisted in the Union cause. Well, there were plenty of Irish in the Confederate cause too. However, perhaps 20% of the Federal Army, at least in the East, was Irishmen, some of whom had just stepped off the boat into the recruiting depots. So if he had been able to get the Pope to condemn the Irish, it would have been a blow to the Union cause, but the Pope sidestepped that whole issue. As the Confederacy started to lose consistently, Benjamin became an early supporter of arming the slaves and enlisting them in the Confederate Army. And he wrote to a schoolmate, if they are to fight for our freedom, they are entitled to their own. So at this point, it maybe had been pragmatic on his point, but he saw the necessity of enlisting every man possible. And as we'll see, he was also in charge of the Confederate Secret Service. He appointed a former Federal Department of the Interior Secretary named Jacob Thompson to run clandestine operations to undermine the Union war operations. And they had a very extensive network operating up and down the Chesapeake Bay. It was called the Zarvona Network. And you're familiar with Chesapeake Bay. You see all the little rivers and inlets and everything. It was easy for them to smuggle men, medicines, messages, that sort of thing, up and down the Chesapeake and then up through Wilmington and Philadelphia. But they also had a huge network up in Canada operating out of Montreal. And the network in Canada was responsible for two major events. One was an attempt to burn New York City. And agents of the Confederacy managed to set a dozen or more fires in New York theaters and hotels. And, you know, they thought, well, if we can burn down New York City, we can threaten all the major population centers and the Union will just give up. It didn't work, but they did manage to cause some chaos in New York. They also had a raid on St. Albans, Vermont, which I'll get to in a minute. And then there was a Union raid called the Dahlgren raid, which caused the Confederacy to hatch a plot to kidnap Abraham Lincoln, take him to Richmond and hold him for ransom. And the ransom was going to be that all the Confederate prisoners of war in the North, there was probably 70,000 of them at the time, would be turned loose to come back and fight. As far as we can tell, there was no plan to make the Union give up the war. A guy named John SURRATT, that last name may be familiar to you. He was in the employ of Judah Benjamin in the Confederate Secret Service. And this leads to the whole question, was Benjamin involved in the Lincoln assassination? This is the Confederate raid on St. Albans. Judah Benjamin did apply approved the plan. 21 Confederates went into St. Albans, Vermont. They robbed 3 banks, killed a civilian, and took $200,000. And then they retreated back across to Canada. And the Lincoln administration threatened the Canadian government with, we're going to send our troops into Canada to get these guys. And the Canadian authorities managed to arrest the raiders. They sent the money back to St. Albans. But even though these men were in civilian clothes when they did the raid, the Canadians said they were operating under military orders, so they refused to return them. So the big question, was the Lincoln assassination an official plot of the Confederate government? And we still don't know, but I mentioned the Dahlgren raid. Ulric Dahlgren was born in Bucks County, and his father was a rear admiral in the Union Navy. He was an impetuous, reckless guy. He was wounded after, as he was pursuing the Lee retreat from Gettysburg. And he had his foot amputated, but he returned to service. And in March of 1864, he was leading a detachment in the so-called Kilpatrick raid, which was going to supposedly take Richmond and free Union prisoners at Belle Isle and Libby prison. On his body, it's alleged that the Confederates found orders for Dahlgren to go into Richmond and assassinate Jeff Davis and the entire Confederate cabinet. And it's known that Judah Benjamin was present when these papers were presented to Jeff Davis and read. And of course they were published, and it inflamed the South for revenge. And surprisingly, these orders have disappeared. We know that Dahlgren and Lincoln were familiar with each other, but many historians think that these orders that were found on Ulric Dahlgren's body were signed or came from Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and possibly after the war, Stanton was able to make these papers disappear. The other name that was familiar is John Surratt. Was he a co-conspirator in the Lincoln assassination? Well, we know he was a spy and courier for the Confederates. We know that he met with John Wilkes Booth in December 1864, and he was introduced to him by Dr. Mudd as a man who could secretly travel to the South. And Booth and Surratt acknowledges this, came up with this conspiracy to capture Lincoln when he was taking his ride out to the soldiers' home in Washington. And the plot failed when Lincoln decided he was going to rearrange his travel plans that day. Surratt acknowledges that he met with Judah Benjamin in Richmond 2 weeks before the Lincoln assassination, and he was given $200 to carry dispatches to the Confederate ring up in Montreal. After the war, Surratt fled, and he eventually ended up in Egypt. And the US government managed to have him extradited from Egypt in 1866, and they put him on trial. And he maintained at his trial that he was not a part of the assassination plot. It was ruled a mistrial at some point, and Surratt was never tried again. But you'll recall perhaps that his mother, Mary Surratt, who ran the boarding house where Lincoln and his fellow conspirators lived, was where Booth and his fellow conspirators lived. She was hanged for the crime of killing Lincoln. I believe she was the first woman executed by the federal government. So the Confederacy is collapsing, and in April, Davis and his cabinet escaped from the burning Richmond and traveled to Danville, Virginia, and from there to Greensboro, Charlotte, and Abbeville. Now, for some reason, Benjamin's spirits were high. A cabinet member said he had hope and good humor, were inexhaustible. And when Davis met with his cabinet to ask whether they should surrender or not, Benjamin stood with Davis, believing that they were going to be able to triumph in the end. Foolish, but that's what he said. However, when he gets to Abbeville, South Carolina, he tells Davis that he's going to go to the Bahamas, and he's going to rally the the Confederate agents in all these foreign countries, and then he's going to join Davis in Texas, and they're going to carry on the revolt against the Union from Texas. However, General Boulevard says that Benjamin told him he was bound for the middle of China. So it sounds to me like he really had no plans to carry on the Confederacy in Texas. So from Georgia, he makes his way through the Florida swamps to the west coast of Florida near Bradenton. And he stops at the Gamble Plantation, and then he makes his way to Nassau. He's involved in a shipwreck, and eventually he gets to Southampton, England in August of '65. There's the Gamble Plantation near Ellenton, Florida. You can still tour that. In fact, I did that. Chuck, you live pretty close to there during the winter. You ought to go over and see it. It's a really nice, nice tour over there near Bradenton. So what was his role in the Confederate States of America? Well, interestingly enough, when Jeff Davis writes his memoirs in 1880, he mentions him only twice in 1,500 pages. Why was this? Again, historians argue. First of all, Benjamin, writing from London, told Jeff Davis he didn't want to be mentioned. He was too modest and whatever. Davis also didn't want to be associated with the rumors that Benjamin had orchestrated the Lincoln assassination. So he opened up as much distance between himself and Benjamin as he could. Remember, he was not tried for treason, but Davis still didn't want to be associated with any assassination. And another reason was Benjamin was one of the very, very few Confederates who left the country and never came back. And he was prospering in London. He became quite wealthy. And Davis may have been envious of him because the Confederates who stayed in the United States, many of them had trouble making ends meet. So that's still a curiosity. Why was he mentioned twice in 1,500 pages? Because Davis's wife said that Davis and Benjamin were together 10 to 12 hours every day. And Benjamin was his right hand. And she said they're two masterminds which seem to complement each other. So that's a mystery. Plus, did he steal the Confederacy's gold? If you watch the History Channel, there's always these mystery shows. Many of them deal with the missing Confederate gold. It's alleged that the Confederacy had $17 million in gold at the end of the war, which in today's money is $300 million. And that they took this and they hid it, and it's somewhere, you know, between the swamps in Georgia and Florida under an oak tree. There's 17 million in gold. Or did Benjamin steal it and take it to England? Well, he was shipwrecked and he lost all his possessions except what he had on his person. So I don't think he took the Confederates' gold. So he arrives in England, and he studies law. I mean, he's an accomplished lawyer in the United States, but to practice in England, he had to study law for 3 years. There were several law schools in England. One's called Lincoln's Inn. So here's this 55-year-old man studying law with young men who have just gotten out of Oxford and Cambridge. He petitions for a waiver on the 3-year requirement. He claims, number one, he's a political refugee, which is absolutely true. And he's also claims he's a natural born subject of Her Majesty. And that's also true. He was born in the British Virgin Islands. So he's a natural born subject of Queen Victoria. Well, he has very many powerful friends. He's a gregarious, humorous guy. He meets a lot of British people with influence. And after 6 months, he is granted admittance to the bar in England. And his career in mercantile law takes off. And he writes a book called Benjamin's Treatise on the Law of Sale of Personal Property, etc., etc. This book becomes a legal bestseller. Every lawyer in England needs a copy of this book because Benjamin, who has dealt with contracts and lawyers all over the world, knows his stuff. And this becomes a standard work for many, many decades. It's still in print, as you can see. This is Lincoln's Inn in London. This is one of the 4 Inns of Court to which English barristers belong. Judah Benjamin, the English barrister. In 1872, he's appointed Queen's Counsel, and that's a picture of him in his regalia. I think they still wear all this stuff. He's the most celebrated American lawyer in England. Once he becomes Queen's Counsel, he's allowed to argue cases before the House of Lords and the Privy Council, which handles cases from all over the British Empire. So in 10 years, he handled 136 cases. A New York Times reporter interviewed him in 1879 and estimated his income in today's dollars at $3 million. He built a mansion in Paris where his wife and daughter are living and had been since 1845. And he retired there in 1883. He didn't have a long retirement, a little over a year. He has a heart attack in Paris. His wife insists that he be given the last rites of the Catholic Church. And he's buried in the St. Martin family crypt at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. Interestingly enough, it wasn't until 1938 that his name was put on the grave. The Paris chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy put that plaque on his grave there. In the United States, he was basically ignored by the Jewish community. It's estimated that 10,000 Jews served in the Confederate Army, but and for good reason, for many years, the Jews wanted no association with slavery. And they did not put up monuments to Benjamin in the United States. However, in Charlotte, North Carolina, a Jewish synagogue was somehow thought it was a great idea to put up a plaque to Judah Benjamin, even though he'd only stayed in Charlotte about 2 days when he was retreating from Richmond. They put up a plaque, and this summer you can see it was desecrated with Black Lives Matter on there. So there's not too many monuments in the United States to take down. That's the end of Judah Benjamin. I thank you for your attention. And if you're really intrigued by this guy, this is the only full-length book that examines his life. So I'd recommend that book if you want to find more about him. That's it. Any questions?
Dave, you said in your presentation that you didn't understand why Jefferson Davis wasn't, prosecuted after the war. But isn't it true that this was a conscious decision by Lincoln not to go after Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee in the hope of putting the Union back together. He didn't want there to be those bad feelings if he had executed them. So he decided that if he wanted to put the Union back together, it was better to let bygones be bygones, and he let him go.
Yeah, he wanted to lift up the Confederacy gently. But you'll remember he was assassinated before Davis was captured. And Andrew Johnson was a Union Democrat. He became president. And for the next couple of years, he and the radical Republicans in Congress had lots of battles over this. And immediately after the war, the Republicans started to lose some influence, and soldiers were glad just to go home. It's over, we won, let's forget about it. So other than the gentleman from Andersonville prison who they hung, they really didn't pursue Lee or anyone else as traitors or war criminals. And Davis was held for 2 years at Fort Monroe. You can go visit the cell he was kept in. But eventually the thoughts of revenge and that sort of thing petered out, and he was let go. And you know, we could do a whole other topic on that someday if you'd like.
Well, you know, it's interesting because, you know, when you look at what we did in Germany in terms of the Nuremberg trials, we really aggressively went after them and we executed many of them. But the fact that we never did that with, you know, generals and people in the Civil War is kind of an interesting dichotomy.
Well, they were, don't forget, they were fellow Americans. The generals had served with each other at West Point. They were friends. You know, there's famous instance of Grant and General Longstreet meeting at Appomattox. Grant appointing Longstreet as a postmaster. I think the bad feelings just disappeared. And, you know, let's get on with rebuilding the country rather than you know, exacerbating the tensions.
On that point, Dave, was he just released or was there an official pardon? You didn't mention that.
No, he wasn't pardoned, and I don't think he's been pardoned to this day. Robert E. Lee was pardoned, I want to say by Clinton or somebody relatively recently. It's always nice to be pardoned 100 years after you're dead, I guess.
Well, the interesting thing is that they all went to West Point.
Yeah, they knew each other well. I mean, you know, many. I mean, there's plenty of instances of roommates where the generals fighting each other in particular battles and things like that. You know, it really was a war of brothers and friends.
And Dave, I like that picture of Benjamin, you know, as an English barrister,
Yeah.
smirking. It looks like you could have just put a wig on his other photo and that would be him.
Yeah, he looked pretty much the same all throughout his career, but very interesting guy. Like I said, he was one of the very, very few who never came back to the country. And I think he believes that he probably would have been tried for the Lincoln assassination. And he said, the heck with this, I'm staying and earning a darn nice living over in the UK.
I think it's also worth pointing out that, you know, there's 3 different sects or track in the Jewish religion. You know, there's the Orthodox, you know, and they wear the black hats and they have the beards and the coats. And then you've got the conservatives who are kind of the mainline Jews. And then you have the Reformed, like in Benjamin's case, who basically float where they think they should go and do business and stuff. So it's in keeping with the Reformed Jew to move from country to country, particularly where business is involved.
Yeah.
So it's not shocking to me that, you know, he would go to England and embrace it and take part in business and law, because that's what Reformed Jews do. They're not really wedded to any kind of particular way of living.
Yeah, he was culturally Jewish perhaps, but there's no evidence that he ever observed the holidays. For instance, in Richmond, there was a large congregation in Richmond. In fact, a guy named Meyer was on the Richmond City Council during the war, and they've examined the records of the Richmond synagogues, and there's no evidence that Judah Benjamin ever went to the synagogue during his stay in Richmond or contributed any money. And there's the rabbi in Richmond wrote to Robert E. Lee asking that Jewish soldiers be given leave of absence during the high holy days. And Lee sidestepped it by saying, we love their service, and they're fighting for your freedom, and therefore I really can't weaken the army for a couple of days to allow them to observe the holidays. And Benjamin was Secretary of War, and he did not intervene or anything in that dispute. So, you know, I think he was Jewish probably in name only once he left his teenage years.
I agree.
Dave, you mentioned that England started relying on cotton from Brazil and India and Egypt because of the war. And I don't know if you can answer this, but I was just curious if you knew if that was the main impetus for the timing of building the Suez Canal in 1869, was that reliance on cotton.
Yes, and foodstuffs from India too. I mean, that cut the travel time by what, 2/3 from the Far East to England. And that's why England developed so many bases in the Mediterranean, at Alexandria and Malta and Gibraltar, that, you know, were effective right through the World War II. But that what's it called? Egyptian long staple cotton became a luxury item, and you know, it's why the British Empire had such influence through that area, because they needed those raw materials.
Promoter Mike Lindell of My Pillow, his sheets are made from the cotton grown between the desert, over in Egypt, the Sinai Desert, the Nile River, and one other place over there. So apparently cotton was pretty important over in that part of the country, part of the world.
Yeah, and it helped destroy the woolen industry too in England, and drove people into the cities to work in factories. Dave Goodale?
If
I have a question for you. What is the marriage of Benjamin to his wife? Was it in a Catholic church or in a synagogue? Do we get any?
No, they were a prominent French Creole family. They were married in the Catholic Church in Louisiana. And I think the family was glad to get rid of her. You know, you go outdoors without a male escort. I mean, wow, you know.
Yeah.
Dave, somewhere in the deep recesses of my mind, and that's always a dangerous place. I read something about when Huey Long came along in 1928, that he mentioned that he had he knew who Benjamin was, and that there was some feeling he might have actually copied some of his style. You know, Huey Long was a firebrand, and he tried certainly to identify himself with the working class guy, and really tried to bring up the blue collar workers lot in life. But did you come across in any of your research that he might have had an influence on Huey Long?
I don't know much about Huey Long other than, you read Robert Penn Warren. Huey Long was more of a demagogue, a ranter and raver.
Right.
And
Right.
there's no evidence that Benjamin had that kind of personality. He was a very, very effective litigator. You can see he can take either side of a case and argue it. And he was very effective in England being as a litigator, but I don't know that he had the bombastic kind of demagoguery that Huey Long had. So I really can't answer your question.
Okay. Anybody else have any questions?
Not for this, but before we close, I just wanted to say for any of you who are suffering from cabin fever, and if you want to get out on Sunday afternoon coming up, there will be a silent movie up at the Colonial Theater, a German movie, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and I'll be playing the organ. The theater is now allowed to have a maximum of 130 people in the main auditorium. So that includes the balcony and the orchestra floor. So you have to get your reservations via email at the Colonial box office. You can't just walk up. You might not, there might be 130 people already there, but that's 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. For those of you who have seen the great Casablanca with Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman and Paul Henry, the character played Major Strasse, the German officer who was after Victor Laszlo, the leader of the French underground. That actor was Conrad Veidt. Well, Conrad Veidt is the somnambulist in the character of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, who sleeps so much, but when he wakes up, he goes out and murders people. So it's an interesting movie. So anyhow, it's only $10 a person. You have to wear masks except when you're in the auditorium eating. But it's the first time the organ's going to be played in a long, long, long time. So anyhow, if you've got nothing to do on Sunday afternoon, come on up. All right, great presentation, Dave. Learned a lot. Ann and I
Thank you
very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Greg or Dave, do you want to say a word about next week's speaker?
Next week's speaker is Lynn George, talking about safety on the internet, I believe. Craig, do you want to add anything?